Passenger helicopters started by carrying airmail and eventually wound up flying 30 passengers off of the rooftops of skyscrapers in downtown Manhattan. The promise for the future were 250 mile per hour, 100 passenger monster helicopters flying between the cities. And that never transpired. We're going to tell you why in this episode of Celebrating Aviation with Mike Mashat. By request, and our special thanks to viewer Chuck Mahon for the idea of a helicopter program covering the history of Sikorsky and passenger helicopters. So many thanks. Well, we're going to talk about passenger helicopters, but I could really entitle this episode A Tale of Two Cities. And I came up with that title all by myself. We're going to be discussing New York Airways and Los Angeles Airways, plus a number of other carriers in the US and in Europe. But before we get into that, a little background. My very first flight in anything that ever flew was a Bell 47 at age 10. And I was inspired by a TV program on Tuesday nights called Whirlybirds, where these two guys, Chuck and PT, would fly their Bell 47 and rescue good guys and take care of bad guys. And it was an amazing, inspirational TV show. So I started helicopter lessons when I was 10. And my first helicopter was actually a home built. This is my first solo. I landed that thing right next to a tree in the backyard. Thanks for the photo, Mom. Appreciate that. And by my teen years, I was logging a fair amount of time on New York Airways helicopters. We'll look at those in a moment. And up until COVID, I was a proud volunteer helicopter crew member with the Aero Bureau of the LA County Sheriff. But this episode is going to begin with a company called Sikorsky. Russian-born Igor Sikorsky founded his company in Stratford, Connecticut in 1923, initially developing a successful series of flying boats in the late 1920s and 1930s, including the S-38, the S-40, and the S-42 Clippers for Pan American Airways system. His first helicopter, the VS-300, seen here with Sikorsky himself at the controls, proved the validity of a single-engine, single-main rotor design configuration, which led to the R4 for the U.S. Army in 1942. This machine evolved into the R5 and the R6, and eventually the civilian S-51, the first helicopter to be certified for commercial operations carrying airmail and passengers. The H-19, or Navy H-04S-1, shown here, became the civilian S-55, a 6-passenger skybus used by both LA and New York Airways for commuting to local airports in those two cities in the early 1950s. The larger and more powerful H-34 was the military version of the S-58, first flown by Chicago Helicopter Airways in 1956 and used by Sabena, Belgian World Airlines, to launch the first intercity passenger service between Brussels and Paris during the 1958 World's Fair. The Navy twin-turbine HH-3 Sea King and the Air Force Jolly Green Giant, seen here, became the 30-passenger S-61, introduced into service by LA Airways in 1962 in the United States, and also flown in the United Kingdom, serving with British European Airways and British Airways on intercity routes and ferrying work crews to oil rigs out in the North Sea. Another British aircraft deserves special mention, the revolutionary Fairey Rotodyne, a 200-mile-per-hour, 48-passenger hybrid helicopter airplane autogyro, first flown in 1957. With its giant 4-blade main rotor propelled by tip jets and Napier Elan turboprops mounted on stub wings, the Rotodyne was designed for longer-range intercity routes like London to Paris in Europe, or Washington, D.C., Philadelphia, New York, and Boston in the U.S. Several were even ordered by New York Airways. However, despite an excellent safety record over numerous successful test flights, a combination of operational complexity, piercing noise, and the consolidation of Britain's proud aerospace industry resulted in the Rotodyne's cancellation in 1962. This brings us to Piosecki. Frank Piosecki began his company near Philadelphia, Pennsylvania in 1941. building the first U.S. twin rotor helicopter, the XHRP-1 Flying Banana. Coast Guard versions were even painted yellow. Later designs included the Navy HUP Retriever rescue helicopter, the Army's H-21 transport, and today's CH-47 Chinook heavy lift helicopter. The H-21, seen here at Edwards Air Force Base, became the Vertol 44B passenger helicopter for New York Airways in 1959. Vertol, the company's new name in 1956, was actually a contraction of vertical takeoff and landing. The company became Boeing Vertol in 1960 and Boeing Helicopter in 1987. The 44B carried 14 passengers and was used in between New York's airports, giving spectacular views to the passengers of the Manhattan skyline, as you see here. But there was a promise for the future, a twin-turbine, jet-powered passenger helicopter called the Boeing Vertol 107. It had a novel baggage arrangement where the baggage bay was in a door that slid aft from the rear fuselage of the helicopter. And that actually came to be. Here's a 107 seen at Teterboro Airport. You can see the aft baggage loading facility and the passengers deplaning from the helicopter. So we went from the Vertol 44 to the 107, which began service July 1st, 1962. 2 weeks later, a 107 wound up in the East River. They're not amphibious per se, but the helicopters were designed to float. So thankfully, all 19 passengers and 3 crew members were rescued safely. But what had happened is that a access door to the forward rotor mast opened in flight. And that is right here. And some insulation flew back and was ingested into the number 2 engine, which fought out the power plant and caused the helicopter to lose altitude and land in the East River. So here it is after being towed to shore by some police boats, and you see the New York Fire Department fireboat in the background. An inauspicious beginning to jet helicopter service, but again, no one was hurt. And unfortunately, 2 weeks later, another New York Airways 107 encountered the same exact problem and landed within a few hundred yards of this location. And so the solution was to put screens on the inlets for the engines, and that solved the problem. But now we go from jet helicopter service in the early 60s to something really special, flying 107s from the roof of the Pan Am building in Midtown Manhattan. The first rooftop operations in New York were in the late 1940s at the Port Authority building on 42nd Street. You see the Empire State Building in the background. Here we have a Bell 47D landing on the rooftop. And these guys flew in a New York Airways 107 from Midtown out to the New York World's Fair, landing on the rooftop of the Port Authority exhibit. And they were whisked away to play the famed 1965 Shea Stadium concert. I think they later went on to some bigger things in the music industry. But let's look at the 107 on the Pan Am building. This is a novel idea. It was tested in the early 60s and then put into operation in 1965. There was even consideration for flying Marine One, the president's helicopter, to land on the roof if he had to go to the UN building or the Midtown Manhattan Hotel. But that was deemed as just not a practical idea, and the Marine pilots weren't all that thrilled about it, so it never came to be. But here we see a test landing on the Pan Am roof with the 107 coming in from the south. We're looking east, and that's the Chrysler building spire in the background. And here we are looking south at the Empire State Building as the 107 is finally landing with passengers who are being prepared to deboard. So what we had was inter-service between all the 3 New York airports and Wall Street. And the Pan Am operation was only to JFK and back, but it really covered the city with the convenience of helicopter transportation from early in the morning till quite late at night. Here's the inside of the 107. It was a 25 passenger helicopter, 2 on the left and 1 seat on the right. And there were some significant challenges for passenger helicopter airlines, and they were as follows: high operating costs, high maintenance cost, high cost of tickets for the passengers, the high number of cycles per day. New York Airways alone had nearly 300 flights. The need for airline or government subsidies, and unfortunately, a not spectacular helicopter safety record. Here we see the New York Airways 107 at the TWA terminal. It was originally operating at American's terminal and also Pan Am. TWA had sponsored the helicopter service to the New York World's Fair from the JFK terminal that you see in the background, and that's the Sikorsky S-61. S-61s were later brought back in the early 70s and were doing quite well, flying passengers from the Pan Am building until May 17th, 1977, when tragedy struck. Ironically, it was not an airborne accident. There was such major concerns in the early days that a helicopter would be caught in a wind shear or crash into the side of the building. But this was an S-61 that was preparing to board passengers. It was on the rooftop when a bolt in the right main landing gear sheared, and the helicopter literally just toppled over on its right side with the rotor blades spinning. Sadly, 4 people lost their lives on the rooftop, and a woman on the street below was hit by a part of a rotor blade and lost her life as well. And this brought to a sad end all helicopter operations off the roof of the Pan Am building, which is the MetLife building today. But we're going to close by looking at Los Angeles Airways out on the West Coast. They began operations with the S-51 in the early 1950s, carrying airmail. This is a S-51 taking off from a helipad in Pasadena, and then grew to the S-55, a 6-passenger Sikorsky piston-powered helicopter that provided service literally all over the Los Angeles basin. Here we see the idea of the convenience of the S-55 awaiting passengers as they get off their United DC-6 and literally just walk over to the waiting copter. This wasn't always the case, but they flew out to Disneyland. They flew to a number of cities, Pasadena, Van Nuys, and really provided convenience for people traveling in the Los Angeles area. Here we see the copter at Disneyland. That's the TWA moon rocket in the background. And there's a better view, and you can see the woman holding onto her hat over there at the waiting area. The TWA moon rocket was in Tomorrowland, which was featured when the park opened in 1955. Here's kind of a nice view of it. It didn't actually go to the moon, as you might imagine, but it was an interesting ride. In the 1960s, LA Airways had upgraded to the twin-turbine S-61, providing service mainly from the Disneyland heliport, as you see here. And sadly, there were 2 tragic accidents with S-61s being lost in residential areas on their way to LAX, which brought down the curtain on those operations as well. The S-62 single-engine, smaller helicopter was proposed for LA Airways, and they never flew them. Although this company did, San Francisco Oakland Helicopter Airlines, which provided shuttle service between San Francisco Airport and Oakland Airport with the S-62 and the larger S-61, as you see here. In the 1970s, service was resurrected briefly in LA with Golden West flying some S-61s left over from LA Airways. And Golden West was a commuter operation that flew Twin Otters around various cities, but they had helicopter service from Disneyland to LA, and I flew on this helicopter in 1972. So there you have it, a look at passenger helicopter operations in the US and Europe. And what it was like to fly on these helicopters was a lot of fun. It was expensive, but it definitely got you around those cities in a very convenient way. Thank you very much for celebrating aviation with Mike Mashat by request. As always, we'd like to thank the special people that helped make these videos possible. Mr. John Sloan, passenger service agent at New York Airways, Craig Cadera, who supplied the LA Airways photos, and my dear friends John Proctor and John Thau for their support as well. We hope you enjoyed this episode, and until next time, take care.